Welcome back to the Daughters of the Moon podcast. Mom and I are both really grateful that you can join us for another week. And we are super excited today. We have Tracy Doyle on with us. She's an author, entrepreneur, and creator of the Aurora Method. She's an nationally recognized entrepreneur, emotional wellness advocate, and author of Life Storms, Finding Your Clear Sky. Her journey from a childhood shaped by trauma and instability to becoming an award-winning business leader and resilience coach is a testament to the power of reinvention and healing. After building a multi-million dollar medical communications company and earning accolades like the Ernest and Young Entrepreneur of the Year award, Tracy faced a breaking point, emotional burnout. I think we can all attest to that one. This personal crisis became the catalyst for her transformation and the creation of the Aurora Method, a practical psychology informed mindfulness based framework helping professional women overcome burnout, reshape limiting beliefs, and reconnect with themselves and others. Through her books, masterclasses, and 8-week course, Tracy empowers professional women to break free from the patterns keeping them stuck so that they can lead their lives with calm and clarity and confidence, reminding them that no matter how turbulent life feels, clear skies are always within reach. So I'm super excited to hear about this. And so welcome,
Yeah.
Tracy, to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Kim and Barb. I'm honored to be here today.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your story and how you got on this journey to helping women cope with all of these things?
Yeah, and thank you for sharing all of the background. I find that, when people hear my story of who I was, meaning like on the outside, I find sometimes people feel sort of intimidated by that, right? But it wasn't always like that. I grew up in poverty. I was born to a mom, sadly, who was mentally ill at a time when people didn't know what bipolar disorder was. And so, what that looked like for me, and that's not a knock on anyone who has mental illness, it's that mom made bad choices. And she really struggled in managing, being a mom, a single mom, and managing a job. And it was very, very difficult for her. And so, I was raised by my grandparents. And so when I came into the world, my mom was a teenager, and my grandparents were recovering from having lost everything because my grandfather was an alcoholic. And so I was sort of coming into the world as a big surprise and the youngest of 10, essentially, is how I was raised until my mom finally got married. And throughout that period, that 7 years before my mom got married, my grandmother, not understanding, was always pushing her to, fly right, and sort of be independent. And she couldn't handle that. But when she married, that's really when some significant things for me started to happen. So, first off, my where I came from with my grandparents and my family, given the alcoholism, there was sexual abuse that I experienced with an uncle. And everyone's sort of just too busy and not focusing on the youngest, right? So that was kind of tough. But the profound experiences that I had were, living with my mom and her husband, my stepdad. He was also an alcoholic, but to a degree that was so much different from what I had experienced. My family, we were a big Irish Catholic family, so everyone drank, they played cards, we danced, and then they would fight. And that's just, and I say that sort of glibly because it was predictable. The abuse wasn't predictable, but that was predictable. But with my stepdad, I started to experience scarcity, right? He was, drinking and gambling all the money away. We didn't have running water, we didn't have heat, and my mom was unable to handle that. And so, having two children, I essentially became my mom's parent at the age of 10 and was struggling to feed us, which looked like me, racing kids on the schoolyard for food. And if they didn't give it to me, I was a scrappy street kid, and I would just beat them up, right? Because I had to provide. And so that really shaped me into someone who became very self-reliant, and survival skills really kicked in. And so the biggest and most profound trauma I had though was my stepdad's bottom from his, his addiction and his gambling, took him to his death. And that death was a murder. And so, my mom and I was 11 years old at this point. My mom and I discovered him. And that just rocked me to my core, having experienced something like that. Because back then, kids were seen and not heard. My mom received psychiatric intervention and support. No one even talked to me about it, so
Right.
I was left managing that. And so, what that looked like for me was a vow that I was never going to ever be in poverty ever again. A vow that I was, because school was my respite, I was smart. So I had survival skills and smarts. And so I was like, this is it. I'm getting out of this. So where that took me was the first in my family to go to college. And I made it, right? And it was real exciting. But here I was left with all these things way in the back of my mind. And I don't want to say that I didn't get help because I did. When I finally shared about the sexual abuse, my family intervened right away and I received help. But as I was coming up in the world and I was focused primarily on I have to do this, I have to succeed, I have to, I'm going to do this. And, I wanted to become a counselor and a clinical psychologist. I was the first in my family to go to school. I studied, my passion was always helping others. And I just couldn't afford to get my advanced degree. So I pivoted and I went into business. I was very fortunate. I had, many mentors who just, understood my story and they just propelled and pushed me. And so I went into the pharmaceutical industry and I had an incredible career. And I ultimately started my own business. But I tell you this, and you heard all the good stuff about who I became, but who I really became was a person who was driven to being a human doer, And so, here I was, I grew up with this belief that I always had to sacrifice myself for my family, for my job, and for the people in my life, my relationship. And that sacrifice, well, that took me on an entirely different journey. And, it took me actually to a breaking point. And I share this because what burnout looks like, and I just want to touch on that before I tell you that journey. What burnout looks like is it starts looking like stress, and you think, all right, I'm stressed. And yeah, I'm pushing myself to succeed. Then we start getting more responsibilities. And in my case, what those responsibilities look like was my mom needed me to be her caretaker after my grandmother, passed away. I'm sorry, when my grandmother retired, rather. Sorry, I said the wrong thing. My sister, sadly, is like my mom, and she couldn't manage the children she had. So I assumed custody of her children. Meanwhile, I'm building my own relationship and, we buy a house and we're trying to build our own life. And so I had all these things, but I was a vice president at this point, right? So that became overwhelming. And so that overwhelm became, I just have to keep doing this. I just have to show up. I have to keep doing this. And while I was feeling overwhelmed, I started to experience conflicts. And burnout, a lot of people with burnout will say, no one supports me and no one understands me. And it looks like I always punch my hands together because it looks like you're two magnets repelling off each other. And you feel like you're at odds with everyone and no one understands and no one hears you and no one sees all that you do. Well, those conflicts started to take me to a place of being isolated and feeling alone, and where that took me next was basically to a place where I was just very reactive. I found myself, the holidays are coming, right? We're coming up on Christmas. I'd find myself, I wanted to have the big family dinner, but yet I'm yelling at everybody. I could not, I just could not manage these reactions. So here it was, December 21st. It was a cold, gray winter's day. We're around the holidays, and I'm at that breaking point. And what this looked like was I getting ready for work, and I catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and my eyes are hollow. My spirit is just dim. And for a minute, I didn't even recognize myself because I just looked so empty. And inside my head, I'm saying, I'm done. I'm done. And and then I start getting all angry about it, and I'm like, I'm done, taking care of my mother, my mentally ill mother, and then then it starts swelling, I'm done being, responsible for my sister's kids, and I'm done being stretched in every single direction at work. And, I'm done being the fixer. I'm done fighting with everybody. I'm done. And I still get emotional because inside my head next I whispered, if you got good and drunk, maybe you'd crash the car. And if you crash the car, yeah, no one would know that you wanted to do that. And, I even in that moment, I didn't want anyone to know that I was weak. I had to be the strong one. And so later that night, I had gone through with that and I was jolted awake by someone knocking on my car window and saying, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And I jolt myself up and I'm like, oh my gosh, my car is facing oncoming traffic and hair away from my head on collision. And I'm like, what have I done? I almost killed two people. That was just unreal. And I was like, I get out of the car, I'm crying. How did I get so lost? And I'm screaming, how do I get my life back? And I'm upset and, and I'm talking to the police and I'm like, it's my mother, it's my sister. And I'm like crying, right? Well, that next day, I had to obviously walk to school because they impounded my car. And I'm walking to school to go to a meeting for my niece, and I'm having a fight it was like my heart and my head, because when I realized what could have happened, I mean, I was so filled with shame, and my head is screaming at me, Tracy, you could have killed two people. How could you do this? Right. But my heart was saying, but Tracy, you're still here, and that was the moment, that was the turning point, because in that moment, I said, I want to live again, and I'm crying as I'm walking. I'm like, I want to live again. And so basically that's really when the first real lesson hit me. And what I learned was that sacrifice is not about abandoning ourselves, right? And so I was like, it's not about abandoning yourself, Tracy. It's about putting yourself first while you're managing everything, right? And for me, that meant getting help. And so, I had to go back to therapy, and I went on a journey of healing. And this journey, it took me, it feels like over a course of 10 years. What it took me was to a place where I finally came to the realization that it wasn't my mom, it wasn't my family, it wasn't my job that was driving my emotional burnout. That wasn't what it was. It was me. It was my own beliefs, and these were the beliefs that were shaped by my early life experiences that drove me. They drove me to burnout. They drove me to isolating myself from people because I was the one in conflict. It just drove me and broke me. So, I always felt like I didn't belong. And that belief, just took me to, if I do everything for everyone, then maybe I will, and when I realized that those are the beliefs that was just one that was shaped, but that was a belief that when I learned how to reshape that, I was able to empower myself to find my way back, to me, and to restore this connection to me, to my life, and most importantly, to the people in my life who I loved. Because at this point, for those who struggle with burnout, you feel so distant from everyone, and it's us that pull away. So I found my way back. And so that journey really led to the development of the Aurora Method, multiple influences in my life, because burnout is something for me, and this is why I'm teaching it now, because burnout for me, I found that I'd go to therapy for things, and they would focus on things in isolation. I worked with executive coaches. I worked with all sorts of people. And, and I read self-help books. I mean, I did everything. I went for, healing work. I mean, I did body work, everything. But inevitably, when I would stop those things, I would start feeling those conflicts coming back, and I would feel the, sort of those reactions coming back. So what I learned along that journey was the practices that really got me to a place of putting together my own, recognizing how to reshape those beliefs, but practicing daily through my own personalized mindfulness program, how to manage them. So how to manage life, that's why I call it life storms. We have churn every single day. We start the day, we think, we're going to do this, this, and that. And what happens? We get thrown off course. That's the storms, the daily storms. And finding your clear sky is about when you practice your own daily mindfulness and you have clear intention for your day, you can manage through that, all that stuff, because your clear sky is about learning how to reset and shift perspective. So that's how I got here. And this is the part that I'm the most proud of because it's about emotional freedom today. It's about connection today and having that emotional freedom to be rather than being a human doer, which is what I was, and being present for those that matter in my life.
That's amazing.
That is good for you. It's seems like a long trip up there sometimes to get where we need to go. But when we do finally get that stability and balance, it is such a reward. So good for you. Congratulations.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think it's wonderful too how like I think you end up in burnout and you don't know you're in it until you're like deep in it for one.
Exactly.
But I think it's wonderful because you touched on, how all of these different places that you can go for healing and things like that. And not that they're not beneficial, but they don't really get down to the root issue. And I think that's
Exactly.
where you're talking about the self-beliefs and things like that and mind shifting is really it's good, but it's kind of somewhat almost a band-aid until you can get some of those other things taken care of.
Exactly, because what it looks like is this. I always, with the people I work with, I always say this. So here I am, right? I'm in the middle here. But what people sound like who are struggling, it's them. If they would just dot 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 dot. And or you hear, it's an us problem. My husband dot 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 dot. If he would just support me, if they would just stop asking me. But meanwhile, where are we in that, right? We're
Mm.
right here in the middle. So it's a me problem. And, the thing that I found most amazing is that as those things were done in isolation, psychology is a big part of the Aurora method because it does go to the root. But when you start looking at how to turn these things around, it pulls on all these various things of what I've learned in psychology, but also what I've learned. There's so much data today on mindfulness and mindful intention. And what it does, it helps us reshape these things and really put them into practice. And when we do, what we find is when we shift, it seems that they got better, right? And our husband is doing something that basically, wow, we never did that before because it's us that's shifting perspective. So,
Absolutely.
Actually, with me, it was learning boundaries better too, like because I wasn't familiar with my own boundaries. So I wasn't putting boundaries up for the people that were helping me move in the ways I didn't want to go in. So, yeah, and then self-love
yep,
helped me as
boundaries and
well.
self-love is so important. And see what the Aurora method does, though, it's so the way it works is it starts off with a self-assessment. And so what you're looking at is, it's just a look back on your life experiences. And the question is this: who are you angry with and who hurt you? And for most people, things just bubble up to the surface real quick. And that's all we're looking at. It's not like you got to go deep over every single, you know what I mean? It's just what comes to the surface. And I'll explain why that's important in a moment. But what comes to the surface? What did they do? Right? And you write it down. How did it affect you? And it's little check boxes, right? It affected my esteem, or it affected, my security, my emotional security, or it affected what I wanted for myself, my ambitions, or it affected my sense of belonging with friends and such. And then from there, so what did you do in response? Now, for someone like me with trauma, it was like, how could you ask me that question? But it's not about deserving something. It's about how did I handle it? So an example would be for the sexual abuse. How did I handle it? I became invisible and voiceless, right? So just hold on to that for a moment because I'll talk why that makes sense. Then from there, it goes into looking at certain traits that we develop, which I'm not gonna, I know you haven't fully read the book yet. So the traits are basically self-seeking, right? So, people pleasing and getting validation and what I call the issues. So, when you think of the term selfish or self-centered, it's really what are we absorbed by? Not that we're bad people. So it's really looking at these traits that sort of block us out. And so when you learn those and you see how you've responded, you can say, I've never loved myself, right? Or you'll say, I've never taken care of myself. Wow, you can see your patterns. And in my case, it would be, I never established boundaries with my family because I never said no. And I would, and here I am, I'm angry at my mom, I'm angry at my mom, I'm angry at my mom. But what did I do? I was invisible, I was voiceless, I never said no, and I kept doing, right? So that one hurt that happened with not that one hurt, because this was years of abuse, but that experience basically led to these patterns of thinking and being that really took me to a place of me thinking it's my mom, it's my mom, it's my mom, but it was me and I could see it. And now it's like, okay, now I have to have the courage to say things differently. How do you do that? Right. So that's the next phase of the Aurora method. What we do is we create what I call a life storm navigator. And it's all about thinking and doing the opposite. Right. So we look at our traits. And then what we do is identify what's the opposite. And then we write down examples of what it looks like so that we actually have our own roadmap of what we need to do. Now, it doesn't mean we're going to immediately do it, but then there's various practices that we do to give ourselves the courage to do it.
Right. Wow.
I think that's good because, and I think I love how you're talking about, answering all these questions about yourself and doing this really deep dive into yourself because I think it's really hard for us when we're digging deep like that, not to put the blame outwards to other people and to look at kind of what our responsibility was in that situation. And that's really hard, I think, for a lot of people. I know it is for myself. And so I think I love what you're saying, and I love that you're teaching people how to kind of navigate through this, even if there's never going to be a perfect world where we're just going to figure it out and it's an ever going thing. But
Well, that's the thing. What really drove, and I always forget to say this, what really drove me to the Aurora method was because my former life was I was in medical communications, which means medical communications is about translating all the new advances in science and medicine and educating physicians and other healthcare providers. So, of course, when I was told I had burnout, I'm like, I want to go to the data. I want to know what to do about it, and all the data says one thing: change your outlook.
mhm.
And now, meanwhile, you're in this, right? And you're like, how do I do that? How do I change my outlook? And so many women I work with will say the same thing. You expect me to change my outlook? How do I do that? If my husband would this, or if my friend would that, or if my mother would this. And so I laugh now because I was that same person, like frustrated, like, no, I don't know how to do that. So that's why I did the exercise of think and do the opposite. And it all started because I looked at that self-assessment was shown to me by a friend. And, I got a little book smart about it. I'm like, if don't ask me if I'm selfish, what does that even mean? And I started really looking at the traits. And when I started to see my own traits, I was like, okay, I can see them, I can name them, and now I can change them. And now that's the outlook shift. And it's practice though, because in my own experience, you know, when we stop the practice, it's ingrained and it comes back. It doesn't mean we're bad people. It doesn't mean we're going to become perfect either, because we're human. And of course, we're going to back off on these daily practices, because that's what we do. But the good news is when those are triggered, because I said to you, I was going to say before, what is it that's really triggered? We're refeeling the wound and the initial belief that we attach to it. So in my case, right? So, the situation happens with my uncle. I get sexually abused. So, the initial belief was I can't tell anybody, right? So
Mhm.
I have to keep it a secret, right? And so then where does it take me next? I always point to my forehead. I believe we have two core limiting beliefs. I'm not good enough and I'm not worthy. So I'm not worthy, because if I was, this wouldn't have happened to me. And then where does it go from there? I love Tony Robbins' work. He narrows fear down to three fears. Is it a loss fear? I'm afraid of losing my fam. I'm afraid of losing what I have. Is it a never fear? I'm afraid of never getting what I want. Or is it a less fear? I'm afraid of being less than or getting less than. And then what does that trigger? It triggers those self-centered thoughts, those traits I call them, self-centered thoughts, behavior. And what that does is it tells us to who we are on the outside. You
Right.
know,
I think
so
that's very fascinating. And, I was sitting and listening and this is the way my brain thinks. So, but I think it's interesting that like in your life when you were young and you were going through the sexual abuse and you were going through all of that, and you couldn't speak out, and then you ended up in a job in communications. So
yes.
very much about being heard to then creating this program that's all about, looking and being heard, right? Like our bodies being heard and our inner
Mhm.
selves being heard. So I think that's like a tremendous, accomplishment with that to do that. But that's what just where my brain was
Well,
going.
no, but you're right. I mean, it's a lot of us feel unseen and misunderstood, and we don't feel heard. And, for those of us with burnout who have, I call them it's like reactions that are just not commensurate with what's happening, right? They're like,
Mhm.
for me, they were volcanic. And for others, they go in and they're screaming in their heads, right? So to me, there's two types. And I've worked with many women to see what we look like. And the ones who are like me, we're just volcanic eruptors and we're like, so ashamed of reacting the way we did. The ones who go in usually pull away and they isolate from their loved ones, and it's like silent treatment, and it's just, it's like such a deep anger. And so the idea here is to recognize, those reactions and really recognize what's happening. It's about feeling more and reacting less. But the communication aspect of it is learning how to speak what you need and speak your truth, right? So for me, as the volcanic eruptor, I had to learn to redirect that eruption as it was happening inside so that I could say, I really appreciate you asking me that, rather than, why are you asking me that?
Yeah.
You don't think I don't know what I'm doing? And that was my own belief of I don't, and I know where that comes from too. It's another wound. But basically, you're able to do that. And so, yeah, it is fascinating with communication because I just love, I mean, I studied psychology and counseling and I loved it. And I wanted to teach it so badly and do it. And so now I'm taking all those things I learned as I went on my own journey, and I feel so blessed that I have the ability to teach it to others today.
That's awesome. Well, and I think too, like when you're in that dark part of your soul, that's likely where these things come to you, these thoughts, I think. And it's like those are your traits or your triggers that those are what you need to kind of delve into with your questions that you were saying. So in your book, does it then have some exercises for people to do to sort of um start off on to figure out some of that stuff for themselves?
Oh yeah, yeah. The Aurora Method is laid out in the book. There's multiple exercises. I even provide it's a private page for people who buy the book where they can go and download the tools rather than having to recreate them. They're in the book though. If people want to draw them out on their journal, they can. But you can download them and use them. And so it's really a step-by-step guided framework, and it's practical. Because for me, like as I was going through this journey, the things that felt unattainable were unattainable. I wanted to change and I didn't know how. And so my
Mhm.
whole story and my whole journey is a journey of how to do it. And that's why I'm just so grateful that I can share it now, and that's why I wrote the book, to put it out there for people to learn how. If anyone's struggling, this is the roadmap. But then there's
Well,
people that, like I've met many women who are like, I don't have time to read. So, so I made an audiobook, but also I'm also offering a course, and right now I'm actually offering it as a free course. I want to do a cohort of 30 people, and offer it as part of a holiday gift. It's a $2,000 value, to join the course and go through the Aurora method. I'll take you through it, and it's really guided so that you have the opportunity to really learn it, do it, and practice it, and sometimes it takes that guidance.
it
Absolutely.
does. When I was younger, I took a course in Courage to Heal, and it was a motivational course to help me walk through some situations. It was very good. It reminds me of what you're doing in some ways, where it walked me through step by step of how to face the challenges that I've been through and how to accept them for where I was then. And when I sit back and think about the course Courage to Heal, I don't even know if that book is even around anymore, but it was phenomenal in its time. It was a few years ago, but I did that. But at the same time, it really helped me because after raising my kids and things like that, the kids were older when I started doing it. Was more working on myself at that point, and it was phenomenal because it also helped me know how to work within groups of people where I could communicate. So that's
Exactly.
what you're doing too.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
the
think
one phase of the Aurora method is called acknowledgement conversations. So it's really
right,
learning to have a conversation that diffuses rather than incites. Because when
right,
you feel understood, think about some of the things we say, why did you do that? Right? And what does that do to someone? What do you mean? And it starts it off. So,
right.
learning how to acknowledge is really like I said, like my favorite one recently was cooking over US Thanksgiving, right? So I like my partner loves to hover, right? And so my mother used to hover over me and just take things over. And I could feel myself getting, I'm like, okay, I'm triggered. I'm triggered, and I could feel it. So I do my little 1 minute reset, which is I'm just breathing in calm, I'm breathing out frustration. But then I calmly said, I really appreciate all your help. This isn't helpful though. Can you this? And you know what? It was great. Right. But in the past, that would have been a fight. Why do you have to hover over me? You know what I mean? And then what are you talking about? I'm not hovering. No, yes, you are. No, I'm not. And you can see how relationship dynamics really break down. And for me, the key to emotional wellness, which is why I'm an advocate, it's when we are emotionally well, everyone around us gets well because we learn how to communicate. And I always say we because I feel like we as women are like the CEO of everything. It
Yeah.
doesn't have the title at work. We're the chief executive officer of our homes, of our families, of our lives. And so it's learning how to communicate that and delegate that, and so many of us just, I feel like we just keep taking it in. We become these human doers and we're human doing instead of being, and then we ultimately burn out from that, and that's what I'm hoping to not only prevent but help people who are struggling.
I
I
love that.
think too
And
what you're saying.
sorry,
Go
go.
ahead.
I just was gonna say, I really love that you like wrote the book and had all these different things in there, but that you also have this course that people can do as well. Because I think sometimes, as much as we read it, sometimes we need that help to kind of navigate ourselves a little bit with practices and things like that. Um,
Yep,
and I know, like, as you were talking, I was feeling like I feel like that's why a lot of times when people are in situations and we bark back at people, like sort of what you were talking about, that is that we just become so super self-defensive. And in the moment, like I was just reflecting on a quick through things, right? And it's like, oh, but in the moment, you don't know how to handle that situation on your own without some of this guidance. So I think that's
exactly. And what
Yeah.
we do, I call it jading, and I wear jade so I remember it. So what do we do when we're in that conflict? We start to jade. So what does that mean? We're either justifying why we did what we did, we're arguing, right? Or we're defending ourselves, or we're explaining. And so, the women that I work with, I will always say, remember Jade. It sounds like you didn't jade, you were jading and you didn't remember it, because they'll explain that, because you did this, I did that, and what it's leading to is more bouncing off of each other, because what most of us don't realize, and this is also in the book, what I've come to learn is that we're all wounded, right? So we've all had experiences in our life. Yes, I've had significant trauma, but that doesn't mean someone who was criticized by a teacher or a parent, or ridiculed at school by the bullies, wasn't wounded either, right? We internalize those wounds. And so when we can walk through life recognizing that we're all wounded, right? And if our spouse is reacting, or our boss at work is reacting, are they the problem? No, we triggered something. We don't know what their triggers are, but we have the ability to then acknowledge, right? And so what does acknowledge look like? I'm not sure what I did to upset you, right? You
Yeah.
seem upset.
Mhm.
I'm not sure what I did or said that to upset you. And that's an acknowledgement. Or if we're about to get into that conflict, like I was saying, where I was feeling myself getting churned up, right? I had to reset myself, because I could feel that trigger taking my body over. I could breathe my way through it, right? Which are great techniques that everyone teaches. And then basically I can then just acknowledge, and I can navigate right through that without the fight. But I find that when we're explaining, we then start to get to the place of apologies. And that's not to say apologies are bad, but what I always challenge the people I work with are, how many times are you going to say I'm sorry?
Yes.
Because it gets old,
Mhm.
and
Yes.
it just feels like a rote statement, and it's empty.
Mm.
But true connection and transformation is saying, you know what? I was really sarcastic and it was really unfair, right? That's acknowledging what I just did. So the Aurora
Yeah.
Method teaches us emotional accountability.
Mhm.
And with that accountability, it's wellness, because we're emotionally well and we're handling things a lot better.
True. That's true. I find too, if you're speaking your truth is a hard one too, as you're maturing in life, and that because you want to speak your truth, but what the big what no, I'm not gonna say hang up. The big thing for me was speaking your truth, but thinking first of how to say it,
Yes,
that
exactly.
it's not going to affect a negative side of somebody you're in front of, and trying to stay very neutral.
And,
If you
and
don't,
that's exactly right. And that's why I say remember Jade, because how you're saying it, if you're saying it in a justifiable way, or in a way that's going to stoke an argument, like think of your words. Does it sound defensive, or does it appear that you're explaining yourself, right? Because when
right,
you go there and you can think you're looking, I know most people want to journal how they're going to say something, or they're working it through in their mind. Just remember Jade. All right, do I sound like I'm justifying what I did? Is this going to incite an argument? You know what I mean? Do I sound defensive? You know? And many times we'll say, no, I don't. And then we do it. We speak our truth. And what do we hear? You are so defensive. Oh, I would hate that, right? But I would say in that moment, I'd say, well, I don't hear myself. How do I sound? Right? Because now I'm opening myself up for feedback, rather than I'm not defensive. How dare you say I'm defensive?
right,
So conflicts that we're trying to work through here, because burnout really takes so many of us to that conflict. And even and for folks who don't have burnout but are just stressed and overwhelmed, it does the same thing, right? And we just get snarky and we react and we get, sarcastic, and so the Aurora method, as much as I'm working with people who have emotional burnout, it really does pertain to anyone who's struggling in any relationships if they're having conflicts, because it really
yeah,
helps reset.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think that's amazing because I think so many of us struggle with either burnout or stress and overwhelm in our lives because, like you say, we're sort of these CEOs of our whole entire lives. And sometimes we even give ourselves some responsibilities and jobs that aren't even meant for ourselves. Um, right? But but we do it anyways, and I think that's just our human nature, and that's just part of, how our societies become over the time. And so I love that you're teaching people how to cope through these things and to, create some tools for themselves that they can use to sort of diffuse situations when you get in them. Because you're still, I love that you said that too, that you're going to get into these situations even after you've done this training and even after you've learned these tricks, right? That's a human nature.
We're not perfect, and so many people seek perfection. And
Yes.
that's really our goal is not perfection. It's imperfection and embracing that we're imperfect and recognizing that, when we do something that stokes a fight or when we're reactive, it's really just being accountable to ourselves and to those we love. And
Mhm.
when we do that, like I said, we change the dynamic of every relationship that we touch when we learn it. And I had to learn that the hard way. I mean, I struggled not only at home, I really struggled. You heard I started and built a business as a CEO going through that experience with burnout. The unhidden co or the unspoken cost really of being a leader is going through burnout and trying to look and act strong. And meanwhile, you're reactive, you might say something inappropriate because you blurted it out. I mean, and I would have react like meltdowns. And at the time, I had gone through that burnout experience I shared. I went on my journey, I got better. And that's when I realized I had to practice daily because when it came back with a vengeance. And it was so bad at work. And I mean, I burned bridges. I had to go through then a period of self-forgiveness because I had to forgive who I became, you know? And then I had to practice in a whole entirely different way professionally. And it was not easy, but when you can acknowledge that you're like this, that lessens the shame. You know what I mean? And it empowers us to change. And
Mhm.
it was so hard. I mean, I would be like, oh my gosh. It's like because people come in and say everyone's afraid of you. And I'm like, I know. Like I don't want them to be afraid, you know. But ultimately I had to work really, really, really hard again in managing my professional life too. And this work helped me there as well. And it
Right.
was how to have different conversations than I would in a relationship conflict, at home. But nevertheless, it works there too.
Mhm. When you say it shifts you, does do you find that as people are going through this and kind of delving deep into this thing, and I know you touched on a little bit that it changes your relationships with other people. Does it sometimes end relationships because those people are maybe not supposed to be in our, because I'm a true believer that people, that whole saying of being in your for a reason, a lifetime, a season. And so I truly believe that. So I just wonder if while you're going through this and you're kind of doing this deep dive for yourself, if it doesn't sort of shift some of those relationships.
Well, so I haven't seen anyone end a relationship, but I will say that I'm not a therapist. So when people are struggling on a deeper level where the Aurora method is not taking them to the results they want to see, I'm going to encourage them to go to therapy related to their relationship. Because, I have personally been burned by coaches who promise everything. And, this is not that, right? This is really it's not therapy. It's learning a framework that can help. But if there's deeper stuff there, and I know because there was not too long ago, a person who had some deep stuff that was way beyond what I do. And once I saw what was happening, my guidance was she needed to go get some additional support outside of me. Um, the good news is as she's learning some things, she'll bring it back and we'll talk about how to communicate and use acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And so that's where I can help. But so I haven't in the work that I do with people, if they need to go in that direction, they will. But for the people that I work with, what do I see is first off, you get ahas, right? So let me explain what that is. So for me personally, the one aha I got, and then I'll share some that I've seen with people that I work with. The biggest one I got was when I realized I wasn't accepting my mom's mental illness, right? And I was unkind in how I treated her. And it was like, oh my gosh, right? That was an aha when I saw how I was acting. And so I knew I could change that, right? And my mom was only capable emotionally of having a one-way relationship. So, what I was focused on was what I didn't have with her. And all of a sudden I realized, but I do have a relationship. It's just that she has it with me. And meanwhile, I have all these other people in my life that nourish me. And so that shifted everything in that one example. But there's a woman that I recently worked with, and her situation is she had experiences that led her to believe that, she's not supported. Okay. So we go through the Aurora method, and when I'm doing the course, I'm guiding you to look at your patterns, but when I work one-on-one, I'm really helping you see them, right? So in a group coaching situation, I will, for people who are willing to show their work, we can walk through what the aha moments are. But individually, I'm going to really walk you through those, right? So anyway, what we see is we see how that one wound created this belief that she wasn't supported. And then we walk through her relationships where she had all these people who she was angry with and hurt. And I said, can you see how you not being supported is playing out? But meanwhile, when you look at what they did, it wasn't commensurate with basically what you're believing about them. And she was like, oh my gosh, this has wreaked havoc for me for years. I mean, it cost her roles at work. It cost her, a relationship. It cost her a friendship. And so the next thing we look at is, how do you mend? How do you go back and bridge, right? So some people know you don't want to bridge back to. It could have been someone that you've moved away from 15 years ago or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But for people that you want to bridge with, that's where the acknowledgement comes in, right? Hey, I've been reflecting about our relationship. I know we haven't talked in a long time, and I was really thinking about a few things. And what I realized was, I was really treating you unfairly because I was thinking blah, 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 blah. And when I came to terms with that and you know, how hurtful that could have been for you with me just, ignoring you and not writing for or calling you for the last 2 years, you must have been feeling really frustrated with me. And then you sit back and listen, right? I wasn't sure. And this is what happened with her. And she has, restored a relationship with a very, very dear friend. And then conversely in work, she had a situation, big job, I will add, and she was going for the big job, even bigger. And she had a situation at work with her boss, and she reduced right to that place and went to where she would go, which is she would go inward. She wouldn't say anything to the boss. She would go inward, and then she would come out of that meeting crying, pulling everyone in, gossiping negatively. Everyone's trashing the boss. Now, if the boss gets wind of that, what's going to happen? Is she getting the big job? No, right? So the good news was she called me. She realized she shouldn't have, she was crying, but she shouldn't have talked about it. So we talked about, how do you go back to work the next day and deal with that? So she went back the next day and said, I realized I was acting very emotional yesterday. And, I had a conversation with our manager. I realized he was under a lot of stress. So what was happening wasn't directed at me. I said some untoward things and some unfair things. I want to let you guys know my conversation with him completely turned that around, because I realized the stuff that he's dealing with much bigger than me. So she mended it, right? So if word were to get back to the boss, she handled it with dignity and grace. And so that's what Aurora does for us as women, right? And it gives us that ability to really have those conversations.
Yeah. Yes.
That's excellent. And
Well,
thank you for clarifying about, the shifting and stuff like that with, sometimes there is additional therapy, because I think that's important for people to know too, right? So I
Yeah.
think the method sounds amazing, and I think everybody should take it. Well,
Well,
I do
I
because I think there's just so many tips and tricks that would help people out, even if we're not under that much stress. It's still going to help us take a look at our situations and how can we make them work better for us and,
Yeah.
sh really show up in life to be more authentic and, the best version of us that we can be
exactly.
for the most part.
But isn't that who we want to be anyway? Right. So we all want to be that, and I think for so many of us, when we start burning out, we're overwhelmed. We don't like how we act. And that was me. I was filled with shame and I had to really forgive myself for that. And then once I learned how to change it, that's why I'm committed today to really living this on a daily basis. And I will tell you, I'm like everyone else. Sometimes I back off of my practices. And what happens? I call it a flare, a storm flare, and I'll get a flare. And the difference though is I don't have to beat myself up about it. I know what to do about it now. It doesn't have to blow up into this big thing. And that to me is what, is really what it's about. It's how do I want to say it? Like it's really restoring connection. And when we can do that and we seek that emotional freedom and that connection with others, that to me is the greatest achievement. You
Yes.
know, that's what we all want. We want to belong and we want to feel good, right? And so, I spent so many years achieving it on the outside, but was just so lost on the inside. And now I feel whole, I feel complete.
That is
Nice.
wonderful. Can you tell everybody where they can find you and where they can find your book and your courses and
Yeah, yeah. So the book is on Amazon. So it is on Amazon Canada. I can attest for that. I was in Canada recently, but it's on Amazon. But also for those, I will say, I noticed on Amazon Canada when I was there, some folks were buying the book and the price was going up, and I didn't understand why. Apparently, Amazon controls pricing. So if anyone sees a price that doesn't make sense, the hardcover is $25 and the soft cover is $19.95. I don't know how that converts in Canadian. But if it seems way off, just go to my website, tracydoyle.life, click the book tab. You can go through and there's a link where you can actually order the book directly from the publisher who distributes it to Amazon. So you're getting the actual price. But in terms of the course, same thing. My website has it. But what I always recommend before doing anything is schedule a one-on-one with me because I'd like to hear where you're at and if the Aurora Method's right. Because as we talked about, some people do need therapy first. Because sometimes for folks who haven't really uncovered some of the life experiences that have affected them, if they've gone through trauma, like in my experience, it might be best to work through that first because this could stoke some things. For people who work through it, and they're ready. They've worked through and they're still struggling and they're like, when is this going to get better? Aurora Method's perfect. So I always encourage you to schedule that free consultation with me.
Nice.
perfect. Perfect. And what would be a final thought that you would leave with all of us followers and ourselves?
Yeah, what I would say is we don't have to wait for life to calm down to get better, right? To really to shift our perspectives and find those clear skies. It's right and it's all within us. We just have to learn how to do it.
Wonderful.
Beautiful.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you coming on and talking about your book and the Aurora Method and all these different ways that people can, kind of have a tool to navigate through life storms. And I think that's, both of us think that's really, really important for people to be able to do to, like we say, live their best authentic life. So
Yeah.
thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining us.
Thank you,
Yes.
Kim.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
And
We appreciate it too.
yes. And everyone else, we will see you on the next one.
You will.